Hello, welcome to Board with Paint. Today I'll be showing you how to paint all the furniture and doors from the 2021 version of HeroQuest. I'm also including the specialty doors from the Kellar's Keep and Return of the Witchlord expansions. We have a whole lot to get through today, so I'm just going to jump right in. I began by priming all of the pieces in pure black, and I'm starting by giving anything made of stone a base coat in wolf gray. I'm using the airbrush here to speed things along, but if you don't have an airbrush, you could just brush this on. For many of the things in this video, I try to batch paint everything so you can just stay on one color, but I do a little bit of jumping around. I divided the video into chapters, so you should be able to find whatever you're looking for. For all of the wooden pieces, including the doors, I'm using Mournfang Brown. I decided to paint the throne in wood, but if you want to go for that extra fancy look, you could also paint it in gold. I'm going to be painting the skulls and the rats that came with the set. For the skulls, I'm painting them in a base coat of Screaming Skull. Here I'm using Screaming Skull to paint the pages of the spellbook on the wizard's table. I'm also giving the candles a base coat of this. Next, I'm going through all of the books where you can see the pages and covering that in a coat of Screaming Skull. And I'm also painting the bony arm and hand that's on the rack. The rats are getting a base coat of Vallejo Model Color Flat Brown. I forgot to airbrush the Alchemist table, so I decided to use that as an opportunity to do a different shade for the stone. For this, I'm using Reddish Gray by AK Interactive. I then decided to use this on the upper parts of the stone on the wizard's table, just to get a sort of two-tone effect going. The fabric on the rack is getting a base coat of warm gray. The tails of the rats are getting rat skin flesh appropriately. Then moving on to the fireplace, I'm using the reddish gray and warm gray to paint some of the individual bricks on the fireplace. If you're interested in seeing another take on the fireplace, I have a video where I added an LED light to the fireplace to have it actually glow. I show you how I did that. You'll see a link above in the corner. For the sort of placemat on the Alchemist table, I'm painting it in dark green gray by AK Interactive. I filled the inside of this tomb with some gravel and sand using a little bit of PVA glue, and I primed that along with the rest of the furniture, and now I'm giving the inside a base coat of Iraqi sand. Now for the longest, most tedious part of the whole process, painting the vines that are crawling up the sides of all the doors. I'm using Death World Forest for this, and this certainly took a very long time. Many hours later, I returned to the Alchemist table, and I'm giving all of the pages a base coat of Screaming Skull. Now to paint all the books, I grabbed an assortment of colors to use for the book covers. You can see them all here on the screen. And I just go through and randomly pick out books for these different colors. There's no really set way I went about this. I just kind of mixed and matched and made sure that both bookshelves had different colors in different places. I decided to add a little bit of brown back into this. So some of the books I painted with German camo black brown, and others I used Vallejo Model Color black gray. There was some kind of round baubles or glasses that were on one of the shelves. I painted that with silver. And I used Vallejo Game Color Glorious Gold for some of the decorative edges on some of the books. Moving on to the weapons rack, I decided to paint the lion shield in warm gray, and then when we go and do the lion, we'll use red for that. I'm also using this for the scary face on the other shield. And then for some of the weapons that have a fabric handle, I'm using this as the base color, but I'm not doing it for all of them. For the padded cushions of the throne, I decided to use a regal purple. This is Gene Stealer purple from Citadel. Now that the weapons rack is dry, I'm giving the lion on the shield a base coat of Mephiston red. For the two special wooden doors from the expansions, I'm painting the whites of the eye with off-white. I'm also using this for a base coat of the fire in the fireplace. Back to the Alchemist table, I painted off camera a couple of these bottles with the off-white, and now I'm painting this jug in the middle using Iraqi sand. The ink bottle is getting a base coat of Death World Forest. Returning to the weapons rack, I'm painting the rest of the handles with leather brown, and I'm also doing the scabbard of the sword in leather brown. For the bottles on the Alchemist table, I'm painting one of them in red, one of them in blue, one of them in green. I'm using Mayhem Red for this one on the end. And while we have that out, I'm painting the iris of the eyeball on the door of the Kellar's Keep expansion door with red. For the second bottle on the table, I'm using Geraldine Turquoise. I hope I pronounced that right. I'm not covering the whole bottle. I want this to look partially empty. And here for the Rise of the Witchlord door, I decided to go with this color for the eyeball to give it that sort of Game of Thrones undead look. For the final bottle, I'm using Green Skin Flesh. And again, we're not covering the entire bottle, just the bottom portion. We're going to make this look like it's partially full. With all of that done, we're now going with Abaddon Black and painting everything that is in cast iron. So that includes the edges of the table and the legs, the band that goes around the rack, including the other hardware on the rack. We want to make sure we paint these chains with Abaddon Black, including the chains that are wrapped around the wheel. Here I'm painting portions of the mechanism in black. All the banding on the treasure chests are getting done in black. On the weapons rack, I'm painting the edge of the monster shield in black. As well as all the little support pegs that are on the weapon stand. On the sorcerer's table, we're going to do these little drawer knobs in black. Same thing for the alchemist table. And we also want to do these drawer handles. I'm painting all of the hardware and handles on the cabinet in black. I'm also using black for the hardware on all of the standard doors. And I'm also using black for just the handle of the expansion doors. Don't forget to pick out all these little studs that are in the door. And here for the expansion doors, I'm using black for just the handle. The hinges will be in gold to match the original expansions from the 90s. Now we'll return back to the alchemist table and do some details on those bottles. First, I'm thinning down some goblin flesh and sort of glazing this into the upper parts of the liquid. Again, we don't want to completely fill the bottle here. We just want the liquid to go from dark at the bottom to light at the top. I'm using Hyrule Blue for the highlight on the blue bottle. This is being applied exactly the same way. And I'm using Ball Crimson for the red bottle. For all of the stone areas, I'm going to do a dry brush of Ulthuan Gray. Here I'm using a big makeup brush, wiping off the excess, and applying this to anything with stone on it. It's fine to even hit the vines on the doors and things that are colored differently. We'll bring those colors back later. You can see here I'm not afraid to get this on any of the iron areas either. This should nicely pick out all of the edges of the stonework and bring out a lot of those details. Next, we'll do the same thing with all of the wooden areas using Morghast bone. This may look pretty stark, but we'll be toning it down with washes later on. If you're going for a cleaner look on your furniture, feel free to either skip the dry brush or to use a dry brush that's closer to the base color. That way you'll have a more subtle highlight. I want my furniture to look very, very old and dirty, so I want this to stick out. Here on the bookshelf, I'm not straying away from actually putting some of this on the books themselves. This will add to the dirty effect. I decided to also use this for the stone inside the tomb and on the rats. Now we'll mix a sort of wash out of black and brown ink. This is about 2 or 3 to 1 black to brown. And then we're throwing in lots of water. I also mixed in a little bit of flow aid to break the surface tension. And we'll stir this up and apply this over practically everything. You can see it really brings out the stone texture and gets into those crevices. I'm not painting this on the purple parts of the throne, though. I want that seat to look a little cleaner. You'll want to wait for this wash to completely dry before continuing, possibly waiting overnight. Next, we'll do some work on the sorcerer's table. Here, I'm using German camo black-brown to paint the cover of the spellbook. For the bookmark, or whatever this is between the pages, I'm using Mephiston Red. Now moving on to the torture rack, I decided to add some detail by thinning down some Doombowl Brown and using this to sort of apply some dirt and dried up blood on different parts of the device. I decided to go a little bit thicker down near where the foot braces are, almost making it look like the blood sort of ran down, like the feet got ripped off or something. Now we'll move over and do some highlighting on the throne. We'll start off here by mixing Genestealer Purple with some pale gray blue to create a highlight color. This is going to go on any of the surfaces that are pointing straight up. For the armrests, that's mainly just the center. I also want to hit the main cushion and the upper parts of the textured area on the back. And then I'll mix in a little more pale gray blue and we'll apply this highlight again. I do this 3 or 4 times over many different layers, getting a slightly smaller area of coverage each time. Now moving over to the doors, I'm going to apply some Athonian Camo Shade wash around all of the vines. This will bring some of the green back, as well as give the impression of some moss growing in the stone. And now that our highlights should be dry on the throne, I'm applying a coat of Drukei Violet over the edges and in the little crevices of the backrest. Now I'm doing another ink mixture here, this time using much more brown, and I'm using this to cover the inside of the sarcophagus. Now we'll do a little more work on the Alchemist table, starting with the quill and painting the feather with pale gray blue. Then I'm using dark sea blue to reestablish the upper parts of those bottles. Remember, I wanted them to look partially empty. Obviously, we can't paint something transparent, so we're going to sort of go for an impression of transparency. I'm using German Camo Black Brown for the stick of the quill. And now using some off-white, I'm drawing a very thin line at the very top of the liquid level of these bottles. This is where we finally establish how full those bottles actually are. I'm painting all the stoppers of the bottles with Morghast Bone. I'm also using this for the lids of some of the other containers. Now I'm mixing a tiny bit of that with the dark sea blue, and I'm going to give the impression just of the stopper going down inside those bottles a little bit. So we're just doing a small line down the center of the stem of the bottle. Now returning to the bottles, we're going to grab the highlight color we used for each one and cover that white line that we drew in the last step. It's okay for the color to extend beyond the liquid level of the bottle. This will give the impression of some of the light reflecting inside of the liquid affecting the color of the glass above. And finally, once that's dry, we'll apply some glass highlights to the bottle. Here I'm just using some very thin off-white paint and drawing a line on the contour of the bottle and the lip around where the cork is. I did this from the front and the back, just so you could see a reflection from every angle. And then we do a horizontal slice across the lip of the bottle, and also right where the end of the curve is where the bottle flares out. This will give some emphasis to the bottle's shape. Next, I'm returning to all of the doors and applying some Agrex Earthshade to the bottom area of the door to add some dirt to the openings. I'm also covering all of the skulls with a coat of this. And I'm also using this on top of the sorcerer's table. Now we'll do a little bit of work on the weapons rack. Here I'm using Citadel's Lead Belcher and applying this over all of the metal parts of the weapons. I've also decided to get out the off-white and sort of reestablish the white on the monster shield. And then we'll use this to highlight the handles of the weapons that we painted with the warm gray earlier. Next, I'm giving all of the metal parts of the weapons a little bit of a highlight with pure silver from Vallejo Model Color. And then I'm highlighting the leather by adding some off-white to the leather brown and going along the edges and applying a highlight the way we do normally with other colors. Here I'm hitting those little leather straps that are holding the shields onto the weapon rack. For the expansion doors, I'm using Retributor armor to paint the hinges. I'm also using this to paint the outer part of the eye that's at the top of the door. Returning to the treasure chests, I'm painting the emblem with Retributor armor for one of the chests. The second chest, I'm painting the emblem in tinny tin to give it a bronze look. And finally, lead belcher on the final one, so we have 3 different emblems on the chests. The scales on the Alchemist bench I'm painting with Vallejo Model Color Brass. You can also see that I've painted the gauge with off-white and the arrow that's on the gauge with black. I'm also using brass to paint the candle holders on the sorcerer's table. Next, we'll use Vallejo Game Color Polished Gold and apply a highlight to the gold areas on the expansion doors. Here I'm using lead belcher to paint the portions of the scales that are holding the weighing platforms. Next, I'm going over to the weapons rack and giving a coat of Agrax Earthshade to all of the weapons, including the metal, to give it a sort of old rusty look. Now for the boss doors that came with the expansions, I'm darkening some lead belcher with some Abaddon black and using that to paint the main parts of those doors. This will be everything except the large skull in the middle. The amulet on the Alchemist table I'm painting with Retributor armor. Then I'm touching up the candles with some Screaming Skull. Returning to the amulet, we're going to paint the gem, starting with a base coat of Abaddon black. While that dries, we'll give the skull on the big evil doors a base coat of Wraithbone. And now back to that amulet. We'll use some Ball Crimson and do a small amount at the bottom of the amulet and a touch at the top. We want to simulate the light bouncing around inside that gem. I'm applying this over a couple of different layers, letting it fully dry between each one. Next, I'm thinning down some bloody red and applying a highlight to the lower portion of the gem, not the upper portion. After establishing this with a couple of layers, I'm then taking the original Ball Crimson and making it into a glaze, and we'll glaze over the entire gem. We barely want to move the color with this. It's just tying it together. And finally, to sell the effect, we'll give it a dot of off-white in the upper corner in the darkest area of the gem. Next, I'm going to get out my Micron Artist pen and use this for some very small details like the pupils of the eyes on the expansion doors. It's very easy to take this, just go in and add a dot. If you don't have a Micron pen, you can use paint. Just make sure you thin it down quite a bit so it flows nicely off your brush, and use the smallest brush you have. Now for the metal boss door, I'm giving a dry brush of silver to the metal areas that we painted earlier. Next, I'm thinning down some Dollar Rowney Payne's Gray ink and using this to darken the recesses of that metal. I added a little bit of glaze medium to it so that it would flow a little bit better and stick to the surface. Here I'm wicking off an excess on our paper towel, as we usually do with the glaze, and we apply this over all of that metal area. Back to the Retributor armor, I'm painting the frame at the top of the fireplace with this. And now we'll actually paint the fire, starting with AK Interactive Yellow. This is being applied to the lower parts of the flames. And then I'm thinning it down significantly and applying it as a sort of glaze over the areas where the light from the fire is going to spill out. So this is going on the floor, on the bricks that are surrounding the flames, on the inside of the mantle, and a little bit on the edges there. We can also use yellow to base coat the flames on the sorcerer's table. And just as before, we'll thin down some of the yellow and glaze it over the top of the candle. We don't need to go any further than this because the candles aren't going to give off that much light. For the next layer of the fire, we'll mix some Troll Slayer orange into the yellow to create a sort of mid-tone and brush this above the yellow parts of the flame. Feel free to be kind of random about this. There's really no set way to do this. For the uppermost parts of the flame, we're using Mephiston Red. Remember that the hottest parts of the flame are going to be the brightest. So we generally transition from yellow to orange down to red and finally to black at the very tips to give the indication of some smoke. Here I'm applying the red to the very tips of the candlelight. While our fire is dry, we will grab our Micron pen again and start to draw in some of the designs on the Alchemist table on the papers. You can pretty much do whatever you want here. I'm just making it look like there were some notes. Here on the right, I'm sort of drawing a diagram of the amulet like they were studying it or something. There's what I ultimately came up with. And we'll do something similar on the sorcerer's table. Here I'm trying my best to sort of redraw that monster shape that's on the shield on the weapons rack. I don't do the greatest job, but it does look like some kind of a monster shape, so I decided to leave it. On the other page, I draw the inset of a star and sort of give the indication that they are studying a constellation up in the sky. Going back to the Alchemist table, I'm thinning down some Abaddon Black and making it look like we have some ink dripping off of the edge of the ink pot. And I'm also doing some ink splotches on the paper like it was dragged across, leading over to where the quill is. And you can put a couple of random little dots in here. I also decided to draw some very small hash marks on the gauge of the scale. Back to what I've been calling the boss doors, I'm using some Army Painter Speed Paint Pallid Bone and covering the skull with a coat of that. Then I'm applying Nuln Oil to all of the stone. Once the speed paint is dry, I'm reestablishing highlights with Wraithbone on the skull. And then I'm applying a pretty hefty dollop of Nuln Oil inside the nose and eye sockets. For some finishing touches, we'll start to add the skulls and rats to different parts of the furniture. Here I'm putting some of the skulls on the Alchemist table, including something on the scale. You could use super glue. Here I'm using some PVA glue that I had out. This didn't hold that well, so I would recommend super glue instead, which I replaced it with later. Here I'm putting some glue on the feet of this rat, and I am sticking him on the torture rack, almost like he's nibbling on that bony arm. And here I'm attaching some skulls to the mantelpiece of the fireplace. And we'll stick a little rat down here trying to keep warm. For the inside of the sarcophagus, obviously, we'll add a skull. And I also decided to stick a couple of rats in there as well. That'll be a nice surprise for whoever opens it. Now for the painting on the fireplace. I've decided to just print something out and stick it on, but for that we'll need some measurements. I'm using some digital calipers here, and for the width I got 10.44 millimeters. And for the height, 16.3 millimeters. I then took an image of the painting on the fireplace from the original HeroQuest and resized it to match the dimensions of this painting. I printed it out and I'm now cutting it out of a piece of paper, and we'll use some PVA glue to stick this on. There's a link to the file that I created in the description. There's the little painting cut out. And here I'm putting some PVA glue over the entire area and sticking that on. Perfect fit, surprisingly. Now we'll let that dry, and once it's completely dry, I'm then applying a coat of matte varnish right over it. That should help keep it sealed in there. Once everything was dry, I applied a spray-on matte varnish to everything, and that completes all of the furniture and doors. Here we'll go through each piece and do a little showcase of it, starting here with the treasure chests. You can see I opted to use the 3 different colors to differentiate them. Here's a small sampling of the doors. See, we have the vines in there, we have the darkened floor, have a nice, worn, dirty look to them. And here we have the Sorcerer and Alchemist table. I really enjoyed painting the Alchemist table. I found it very challenging. There was a lot of different techniques to apply to this. There's our fireplace, completed. You can see the wash has really tied those colors together. We have our little rat trying to keep himself warm. Here's our throne and one of the tables. One of the bookshelves and the cupboard. See, we have all of the books looking nice and dirty and worn. The wood's looking old and partially rotted. We got a nice highlight on that cast iron as well. And one of my favorites, the torture rack. I really enjoyed how this turned out, especially with the kind of blood effects I added at the feet. And here we go with the sarcophagus, including all of the rats and stuff that I put inside. And finally, the doors from Return of the Witch Lord and Kellar's Keep. We'll leave you with a quick look of some of the furniture set up on the board in action. You may have seen this posted last week on Instagram. If you didn't, feel free to follow me there, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. If you liked this video and thought it was helpful, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribe to my channel. And also, if you leave a comment, let me know what you liked or what you didn't like. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy painting.